ideas, but so far I don't see this as being in the national interest.
Anthony, what does this mean for the United States and our allies? Ian Bremmer, who has given the president a lot of credit for what he's done in North Korea, has said this would be the biggest slap in the face to our Western allies, worse than pulling out of TPP, worse than the Paris Accord.
Maybe it's helping our Western allies. You know, I mean, it is. Well, let me finish. It's a very good time to be on the outside of the international community when you're battling Adolf Hitler. There's a group of people in the international community that want appeasement with Adolf Hitler. And if you go back to 1938, when they marked the appeasement, it wasn't peace in our time. We ended up with a devastating war that killed almost 100 million people. And so maybe the president is actually helping the allies by being the tough cop on the block that's going to impose something on Iran that is, going to topple that regime.
So
let me just say one other thing. They were probably funding the North Koreans, and they probably cut the funding off after that nuclear explosion that took place in the northern area of North Korea where the whole mountain caved in. Okay, and so the Iranian nexus to North Korea has probably now been severed as a result of lack of money. And so I think the president's strategy is let's get peace with North Korea, let's redefine the situation with Iran, and get peace there as well. And there's a huge secular opportunity in Iran that's bubbling up that the United States wants to take advantage of.
I disagree. I'm sorry. I just think that's wrong.
Okay.
For a couple of reasons. Number one, the other things that Iran is doing in the world, building ballistic missiles, supporting terrorists, we should be fighting. But why do you have to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal to do that? Why can't we have a negotiation about ballistic missiles? And why shouldn't we be pushing back on those terrorists precisely in places like Syria where the president is threatening to pull back? We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We did it in the Cold War. We can do it now. And number two, Iran, with all due respect, is not Hitler's Germany. They are not seeking to take over the Middle East in a ground offensive. That is the false analogy. What we need to do, hold the line on the Iranian nuclear deal, negotiate on the ballistic missile piece, and push back, contain and push back on the terrorists. A multi-pronged strategy, just like we did with the Soviet Union.
And almost incredibly, we are giving the Iranians the high ground in a dispute in which they otherwise never could have achieved it. To the international community, these are the people who made an agreement, kept an agreement, had a verified agreement, and we are walking away from it. You almost couldn't make this up. And to your point, there are other things that should be done. There should be restrictions on their ballistic missile program. There should be restrictions on terrorist activities. But walking away from this agreement doesn't enhance any of that. It weakens all that.
When they say that they want to wipe Israel off the face of the map, we should ignore that and not take that seriously.
No, we should deter it. We should deter it, and that's exactly what we're doing right now.
So, yeah, but the Israelis don't think that. Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't think that. I mean,
But how is this? Tell me how this works in Israel's interest.
Look, let me say a couple things, and you guys know that this is the truth. When I was in Iraq in 2011, and the Pentagon was calling for at least 20,000 troops to be in Iraq so that we could prevent the rise of Daesh, now known as ISIS. And they said that there were hundreds and hundreds of intelligence officers from Iran in Iraq disrupting Iraq. You guys can't tell me that the Iranians don't have an agenda to take over large swaths of the Middle East. You can't tell me that they're not funding Hamas, they're not funding the Alawite tribe in Syria.
The question is whether no one's arguing that. The question is, does pulling out of this accord make this easier or harder? Our argument is pulling out of this accord, separating the United States from its allies, potentially now getting the Iranians with no restrictions is going to make all that easier. What you're saying is true. There is an emerging Iranian superstate that is going to run all the way from the Mediterranean to the Afghan border.
You're okay
$500 billion. I am not. But this is not confronting it. This is enabling it.
You're equivocating and you're rationalizing evil. Okay, there's a moral relativism to the statements that you guys are making. And I love the state of Israel, and I want to protect that state. It's an unbelievable ally to the United States.
So
hold on, Bob.
These are bad people. They've got to be replaced at the top there. You
Ambassador?
know that, and we know that. And the president's going to put pressure on that to allow that to happen.
Ambassador.
So the analogy I like is not Hitler's Germany at Munich. The analogy I like is confronting the Soviet Union and the way Ronald Reagan dealt with that. So he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. He said they are evil. He called them evil straight up. And at the same time, Ronald Reagan and George Shultz, his Secretary of State, my colleague at Stanford, negotiated with the evil Soviets on arms control. And in parallel to that, pushed back on them. It was called the Reagan Doctrine, funding what they called freedom fighters in other places where there are communist regimes. The point is, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can even talk about sanctioning Iran for their ballistic missiles program and not pull out of the nuclear deal. And to me, it's just that you gotta make the argument: how are Americans and people in Israel, by the way, I love Israel too, tell me how we are more secure by pulling out of this deal. If you can hear that argument. I mean, you're arguing for regime change. That's not exactly the Trump administration's policy, just so you understand.
And just to follow what you're saying, so starting the day after this, they get more centrifuges, they start enriching more fuel, and the Israelis are more secure. We are going to own this nuclear weapon. Donald Trump pulls us out of this, and they have a breakout program. We are responsible for them getting an atomic weapon.
So it's 2-on-1. So I get twice the time. Let me rebut. First of all, you were talking about a country that was supposedly atheistic, but it had Christian Orthodox values. This is the Soviet Union.
They had a transnational ideology to seek to dominate the world.
Were they an atheist country? What were they? I don't know.
I don't know how that plays.
My point, how does it play here? You have radical religious fundamentalists that are running this country. They think very, very differently than the leadership of the Soviet Union over that 60-year time period when we were defeating them. This is a totally different beast. You know that. I know that. The ambassador knows that. Number two,
we can agree
if you want to equivocate with these people, what will happen is you give them an inch and they take a mile, and that's what the president's saying. So we can disagree. Let's see what he does at 2 o'clock. But I'll make a prediction for you. Okay, a year from now we'll be in a better place with Iran, the same way that we're going to be in a better place on the Korean Peninsula, to the great shock and surprise of all the pundits and the talking heads on cable television.
I hope you're right. I fear you're wrong.
But boy, the consequences if you're wrong for Israel, for the United States, for the region, for the leadership of the Western Alliance, the consequences of failure on this are enormous and generational. This is a high-stakes gamble we don't need to take.
So were those stakes as it related to the Cold War, and so were those stakes as it related to defeating the Nazis. And so these are, and by the way, I'm not calling for the United States to have regime change. I'm not calling for that as a domestic or State Department policy or CIA policy. I'm talking about there are a ton of secularists in Iran that are tired of the nonsense from that 39-year-old theocracy.
And by the way, they support the nuclear deal, just so you know. Those same forces support the deal. So tell me how we're helping them by pulling out of the deal.
Of course they support the deal because it raises their living standards. But you put pressure on this regime will crack, okay? Because they're
so you can
run out of money.
continue to put pressure.
They're going to run out of money.
The deal is the pressure.
Let's see
the
what happens.
idea that the mullahs cannot blame the United States and the Europeans for the catastrophic living failures,
put them on
the
this
loss
side,
of political
hit them both at the same time. It's very hard to hit him from this angle.
There's no hitting.
Verbally hitting him.
There's no hitting anyone, Anthony.
Can you pass me the love pin before we go to commercial break?
I pass you nothing. Ambassador, last point.
Again, I think the historic analogy is the Cold War. It's not Nazi Germany. We should stay in the deal. I don't see how we are better off tomorrow by pulling out of the deal. And I also think we're going to pull out of the deal. And so let's come back a year from now, and I hope you're right. I mean, I hope you're right.
You think we're pulling out of the deal?
That's my assumption, yeah.
Right.
And what do you think, Bob? Then we're pulling out?
I think we are pulling out, and I think it's a rescue line to the mullahs. I actually do believe in regime change in Iran, and I think the only way to preserve peace in the region internationally is for the mullahs to lose power. The only way to do that is to keep them isolated, keep in this accord and not provide an excuse for the mullahs that their problems are American pressure or the Europeans. Their problem is their system and the mullahs.